So today we're going to talk about just kind of being clean and how that can really help to prevent some disease problems in the future. So as we wind down in the growing season, it kind of tends to feel like, okay, we're done. We can just put it to bed and move on and wait for next spring. However, there are still some things that can be done at the end of the season and even in those winter months that can really help to set you up for success next year and limit disease impacts. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. So with that, I want to start just really basic and just cover what is a plant disease. This is a topic that some people haven't explored before. So just to get everybody on the same page, what is a plant disease? And so plant diseases, we describe these as damage that's done to a plant that's the result of a microscopic organism. So all of these little pathogens are very small. We need microscopes to see them in most cases, and they fall into a lot of categories. So fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes, phytoplasmas, and parasitic plants are all plant disease causing organisms. Many of these things sound familiar because they might be things that could make you sick. However, understand that what we're talking about today are only pathogens that fall into these groups that affect plants. They do not impact human health. So basically, we're talking about germs. So plant pathogens are like germs, like you would clean your house. You're going to clean up in your gardens, specifically focusing today on those fruit spaces. So orchards, vineyards, any of those raised beds or potted plants where you're growing any of those different fruits. And so what happens is these tiny organisms go into plants, they cause infection, and then eventually we start to see symptoms. And that's where we start to panic, right? Because all of a sudden our strawberries look something like this, and that's not helpful, nor is that really something anybody would want to eat. So when we talk about plant diseases, it's important to understand that there's a difference between symptoms and signs. So you're going to see a lot. These are all of the outward expressions that our plants give us to indicate that something is wrong. So these are things like blighting, cankers, dieback, even death can occur from some of these plant problems. But what's actually causing the plant to be sick is these pathogens, so these fungal structures or bacterial particles or viruses. All of those are what's actually causing those symptoms that we see. And that really is going to play in here in a minute when we start talking about the actual principles for sanitation. Because what we're going to do is we have to clean up those germs. We have to get rid of those pathogens themselves. So just cutting out sometimes isn't enough, or just taking away the disease material isn't enough. So we're going to touch on those topics, but we have to be very clean to try to get rid of these different pathogens. So obviously we've all successfully grown plants before, and so why do we sometimes get disease and sometimes we don't? Well, for a disease to occur, we need three things, and those are represented by the three different colored circles here. So you need a host plant that is susceptible to the pathogen. You're going to need an environment that's very favorable for the disease to occur. So in most cases, we're talking about high humidity, some leaf wetness. We're talking about warm temperatures. Kind of if you're comfortable outside, that's a good temperature for most of these pathogens as well. And then, of course, we need the pathogen itself. And when all three of those circles or all three of those concepts overlap and we have them all present, that's where we're going to get disease. But when we talk about sanitation, what we're trying to do is take away that pathogen. We're trying to get rid of those microscopic organisms so that we can prevent disease from occurring. So where are these pathogens? Since they're so small, I want to talk about where they like to hide. So they hide in places like plant material or plant debris, so fallen leaves or discarded fruit. They can be in the soil or on the soil, and they can also be in water. We're really going to focus with the sanitation aspect on those first three because that's where we're really, really concerned when it comes to home fruit production. How do these pathogens move? Again, because they're so tiny, it's kind of hard to imagine how they're moving around, but they do so in lots of different ways. And because they're microscopic, in many cases, we don't know that they're moving. So they can certainly be blown on the wind. They can be moved in water. So as water moves across surfaces, we can see where those pathogens move with it. They can be splashed around in leaf, from leaf to leaf. They can also be attached to hoses if you're dragging those around. They can be on our clothing. So if we first go into our orchard spaces or our fruit growing spaces and we work with diseased plants, those pathogens get on our clothes, and then as we move around, we could become the vector or the organism that's moving it around. Certainly, as we talked about, they can be on soil. Now, that might be just the soil itself, but it could also be on your shoes, and it can be on tools. And then finally can be in infected plants themselves. And if we're moving those plant parts around, we have to be careful not to use those as a way to spread them. So it's really important that we just make sure that we recognize how these are moving around, because again, this is going to play into some of the practices that we're going to use when we talk about how we're going to use sanitation to limit disease spread. So what is sanitation? So it's practices that remove pathogen structures that may survive winter months and result in disease next season. So we're basically trying to clean up things and prevent disease in the future. So where is sanitation critical? So it may seem like this is something that may not apply to you, but it probably does. This applies to conventional and organic production or chemical-free options as well. It can be applicable for plants that are in the ground or are in pots, and it's recommended for any number of plants. So if you just have one plant, it still applies. If you have a lot, it definitely applies. So it's really important to know that this is a practice that can be used in lots of different ways and in lots of different situations to really limit disease. So let's talk about how you actually go through sanitation. So there's 3 parts to this because we're going to kind of look at 3 different parts of the plant and how sanitation impacts those. So the first part is we're going to talk about leaves that may be infected by disease. So obviously, it's really nice when plants can kind of self-mulch and all those leaves fall on the ground. And that's great when they are not diseased. However, those diseased leaves are just full of all kinds of overwintering structures, which are special structures that are produced by pathogens to survive our cold winter months. So they lay dormant in all of that plant material until next season. And then at the beginning of the season, here come the pathogens as that new plant material and new plant growth starts to emerge, and all of a sudden your plant is infected. So it's really important to just make sure that you collect all of those leaves, especially if you think it's disease. If you've got a resistant variety and you don't have a disease issue, sure, you're okay. But if you think there's a possibility, collecting those leaves is really, really important. Now, what do you do with them once you collect them? Well, you can burn them, you can bury them, or you can destroy them. And destroy them means to take them off site and get them away from your property. We do not recommend that you home compost these. Home compost bins do not get hot enough to kill these pathogens. So do not put them in your compost bins. If you do have commercial yard waste pickup where you live, you can put them in there. Those go to very large compost piles that are very regulated, and so they do reach temperatures that can kill these pathogens. But if you're thinking about just putting it in your home compost bin, not a great idea, because when you put that compost back out, now you've kind of undone everything that you previously did. So if you have already composted or put leaves in that might be infected, the best process is, if you know that plant material came from your fruit spaces, make sure that when you use that compost, you don't put it back there. So put it somewhere else, put it in your landscape, and that should limit the amount of disease that you would see on your fruit. So making sure that you don't home compost those and just making sure you burn, bury them, or destroy them in some way can really help to eliminate those overwintering structures and limit the amount of disease that you see next year. So the next part of sanitation, or the second part I want to talk about, is what do you do with fruit? And this is one that a lot of people overlook, and that is because when you have apples like this, or you have mushy strawberries, the reaction is clearly just to throw that on the ground. Nobody wants that on their hands. Nobody's going to eat those apples. Those are gross. So the best idea is to make sure that when you are picking throughout the season, go through, pick all the good fruit, and then anything that is bad or gross, make sure that you take that down into its own bucket. And again, we're going to bury or destroy that in some way, not in the home compost bin, and make sure that that is destroyed and that that's not left. This functions in much the same way as the leaves did. All of these fruit are harboring some sort of pathogen that can then go back and infect those fruit next year. So they're just kind of laying there waiting. So try to make sure that, especially at the end of the season, if you do have fruit that has fallen off or apples that have fallen off in some way, go back and try to clean those up as best you can. That does help to take a lot of that inoculum or those pathogen propagules out of your spaces, reducing the amount of pathogens that are just sitting there waiting to infect plants next year. So the next and final part of sanitation is the third part. And this one is a little more complicated, but this is where we have woody tissues that are infected. So branches of trees or canes on some of our brambles, or even woody tissues in our blueberries. So when we identify that there is a problem and we've confirmed that this is a disease issue and we know we need to take it out, how do we do that? Well, we do it with pruning, and we kind of have some rules and guidelines when it comes to pruning, because when we prune, we want to make sure that the wound that we're creating is not a space that invites pathogens into that plant to continue that problem, or make sure that we don't cause any further issues for that plant. So we have to do it at the right time. We have to do it in the right way. So if you're going to prune during a growing season, don't prune right before, right after it rains. Give yourself some space, 12 to 24 hours. Make sure it's going to be really dry. That gives that plant plenty of time to heal that wound and protect itself, so that if pathogens splash against it, you're not going to have an issue. When it comes to making those cuts, you're going to go 6 to 12 inches behind the last visible symptom or back to the branch union. In many cases with cane plants, so your brambles, you're going to maybe take that entire cane out, cut it back to the ground. The reason why we go so far back behind that last visible symptom is because of the fact that the pathogen is not where it's dead. It's where you start to see this transition from decline to living. And so we have to make sure we go far enough back that we cut out all of that pathogen. So that's why we're making such a dramatic cut. Always make sure you're cleaning tools. Again, that's part of sanitation in general, is just cleaning tools. But make sure that when you do that, if you're pruning specifically for disease, that you're doing that after each cut. That makes sure that if for whatever reason you do get into some healthy tissue on the next cut, you don't introduce the disease. When we talk about cleaning tools, there are numerous ways to do that. We have an excellent publication, which is in the resource list, so you can consult that. Most people think of cleaning tools with bleach, and that is one way to do it. However, because most of the time we're using metal tools, bleach is corrosive. So there are numerous other products out there that can be used to clean and sanitize tools. One of the biggest tips that I will give you to try to make sure that you're cleaning your tools effectively is to make sure that you wash them first. That gets any of the plant material out of the way, so that if there are pathogens still stuck on there, when you do your sanitizing, it can be really effective. So kind of wash them off first, get rid of that plant debris, make sure they're kind of almost look clean, and then go back and sanitize them to kill any pathogens. So again, that publication that we have really details that whole cleaning process. It is meant for homeowners, so there's a lot of great information in there. One of the other things that does happen really commonly when folks prune and cut out the dead stuff is it goes on the ground. It's okay for it initially to land there, but ideally you're going to put that in a wheelbarrow, in a bucket, some sort of receptacle that you can then take and move it. Don't leave those branches lay there, because otherwise you're just leaving the pathogen laying there too. So kind of undoes all the great work that you're doing by trying to do sanitation. And again, with pruned plant parts, we're going to do the same types of things. We're going to burn them, bury them, or destroy them. And again, not in the home compost bin. Don't mulch these. So if you have diseased plant parts, don't run that through a chipper and use it as mulch. That again undoes everything that you are trying to do with your sanitation practices. So while we're really focused on kind of the end of the season and the 3 things that you really need to do to try to do sanitation at the end of the season, sanitation is important throughout the entire growing season. So there are things that you should be doing before, during, and after. So let's talk a little bit about that. In the before stages, so this is either before you've planted a plant or before the plant starts to grow. That's when you're really focused on your pruning. Pruning in those winter months when the plant is dormant is a great way to try to limit disease spread and make sure that you're really effective in getting that pathogen out of there. If you're looking to introduce new plants to your space, make sure that you inspect them and quarantine them. So take a good look at them. One part that people usually forget is, especially if you're buying a potted plant, take a look at those roots. The plant that is pictured here is infected with the disease. You can tell it doesn't have a lot of root mass. It also has these kind of dark brown roots. In most cases, plants have creamy white roots when we're talking about herbaceous plants, or nice thick woody roots when we're talking about trees. So make sure that the plant is healthy before you put it in the ground. If you have questions, or if you're buying out of that discount section at your favorite store, we recommend that you quarantine those. That's keep those plants off to the side. Make sure that they are good, that there isn't a disease issue, because if there is, now you just have a pot to clean or throw away. If you go ahead and put those plants directly into the landscape and there's a problem, now the issue's in the landscape or into your specific spaces where you're growing these different orchard and fruit species. So make sure that you kind of take some time to inspect those plants, make sure that they're good to go before you put them into the ground, so that you don't risk upsetting your fruit production. And then also manage weed species. Weed species can be problematic for several reasons. And the main one here is they can also harbor some of these diseases that can then move onto our fruit trees and herbaceous plants. So it's really important to make sure that we go back and get those weeds out of there so that they don't have any diseases on them as well. During the growing season, if you see plant parts that look like they are diseased, go ahead and take them out. Many folks that we know will go back and remove branches throughout the season if they see an infected branch. Just again, make sure that you're really careful and that you're not doing that near a rain event and that you have nice clean tools. If you see leaves, go ahead and take those out. That stops the pathogen from reproducing, which in most cases can be every 7 to 21 days. They'll go through a life cycle and produce more offspring that go and cause more issues. So just making sure that if you see something that's problematic, go ahead and take that out. Again, continuing to manage weed species for the same reasons. Work with your healthy plants first so that you don't pick up those pathogens on your clothes and then move them to those healthy plants. Clean your tools throughout the growing season. It's really common to think of that as kind of an end of the season process, but cleaning throughout the season is very important. And then just limit movement. So if you know you have some trees or some plants that are struggling, make sure that you're not walking through those and then walking to healthy plants as you survey and scout and look at your plants. So just make sure that you're kind of limiting movement through there so that you don't pick up pathogens and move those to other areas. So the benefits of sanitation really, really outweigh the work that you have to do for it. It helps to reduce the amount of pathogen structures that are there that are going to cause disease next year. It's going to allow plants to have a head start. So while sanitation may not completely eliminate a disease issue, because many of the pathogens, especially for fruit, exist in the environment, so they may come in at some point, it does give plants a head start, allows them to build up, get strong, get that new growth out there. And then if the disease comes in, hopefully we're limiting the amount of impact that we're seeing from that disease. It comes in later, or it comes in when that plant is just already really strong. Sanitation can improve the effectiveness of other disease management strategies. So when we talk about other things that we're going to do to try to manage disease issues, taking out all this extra plant debris, taking out, fruit that are infected, and just cleaning up gives those other disease management strategies a better chance to work, and to make sure that then we can also layer things to do our disease management. And this is also a chemical-free option for disease management. So it just takes a little bit of work, no chemicals involved. But one of the questions that I most commonly get asked when we start talking about diseases and then we talk about sanitation is people will say, well, okay, sanitation sounds great, but why can't I just use chemicals? I'll just spray the plants, right? Good point, but we can't just spray to manage disease. And there's numerous reasons for that. So here's a summarized list of reasons why you can't just spray to manage disease. One, these chemicals, particularly fungicides, are labeled and are meant for specific pathogens on specific crops. So you have to find a product that is for that specific crop to manage that disease. That can be challenging, but more importantly, you need to know what that disease is, and that might not be very obvious. So again, we can't just go out and spray and pray. That doesn't work. Timing of applications is important. And so we really have to be careful about when we're applying these products. When we talk about these fruit species, most of them have very dense foliage. And so getting the pathogen or getting the product in to make contact with the pathogen can be really difficult. And so oftentimes this adequate application doesn't occur or is very difficult to the point where it limits the efficacy. In addition, when we talk about for homeowners, there's a very limited number of products that are available. We oftentimes see limited efficacy, which can be frustrating when you're trying to manage a problem. And if you're using these products when they're not needed, or you're applying the wrong product, you're putting chemicals into the environment that don't need to be there. And there's also the chance that resistance can develop to these products. And resistance occurs when the pathogen changes and now that chemical doesn't work on it anymore. And that can really limit the amount of products we have on the market that can have efficacy. So it's really important to understand there are a lot of things that go into managing disease. And yes, chemical management, fungicide management is an option, but it has to be done in the right way. So it's not it's not a fallback plan. It's not the only option. And so it's really important to know, when we talk about sanitation, if you are going to use fungicides, sanitation helps that. It helps the efficacy of that. So understand that, yes, there are chemicals. They can be used. They can be helpful. They can help manage a disease, but they are one part of a process in disease management. So keep that in mind. If you need more information about fungicides, there's lots of information out there. Consult a county agent. They're great resources. If they're not sure, they can reach out to us at UK and we can provide that information. Understand the label is the law. So whatever that label says is how it has to be applied, what crops it can be used for, and what diseases it can manage. So keep those rules in mind when it comes to fungicides. So as I mentioned before, sanitation may not eliminate disease. Disease may still occur. So what do you do? Because most of the time, we don't know that we're going to have a disease issue. So when it pops up, we kind of get stuck. We can recognize that there's a problem, but we don't know where to go next. So here's some guidance. One, contact your county extension office. County extension agents across the state have participated in our trainings. They are excellent resources. But they work in a lot of different ways. So make sure you connect with your county agent when you have a question and find out how they like to work through these situations. Make a phone call, give them a call, be descriptive and honest about what's happened, explain what's going on as detailed as you can. If you can, send pictures, send an email with some pictures, get some close-up of what's happening, show them the whole plant, show them what's happening around that plant. That allows them to have a lot more information to help. Or bring a sample. Make sure you bring the right part of the plant. Dead leaves, dead sticks, dead fruit don't make the best samples. They are already dead. So oftentimes, if they then have to forward that sample on, it takes either a lot of work or it becomes impossible to diagnose the actual issue. So we like the rule of bring dead, dying and diseased, and healthy tissue. So bring that gradient where it's transitioning. That allows us to really see what's going on, allows your county agent to see what's going on, how it's progressing, how it's changing. And should it then need to be diagnosed at a higher level, or your county agent isn't sure, that can come to the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory at the University of Kentucky, which is housed on campus in Lexington. County agents do submit those samples. They do not come directly from homeowners. So again, connect with your county agent. There is a form that is required to submit a sample, and it asks a lot of questions. So it kind of seems like, why do I need to provide all this information? Well, the reason is because our diagnosticians can't see the plant, can't see the site in many cases, because you're just sending a part. And so that information is really critical in helping them through that diagnostic process to get you an answer. And again, making sure that you send a good sample is really helpful. If a sample does come to our diagnostic laboratory, understand that you're going to get a report back that's going to tell you what it's been diagnosed with, and that's going to tell you also some management recommendations or strategies that you can use. We do produce a number of resources. So while sanitation, we have some specific publications on sanitation, which again is listed in the resources list specifically for this presentation. We have a lot of other things out there. So we have numerous publications that can be found on our website. An example is shown here. This is one of our calendars that we have. And so this allows for backyard growers who are producing apples to really walk throughout the growing season, see what you need to be doing and when. It gives you kind of a good idea of when different diseases might come in, what different strategies you can use to try to manage those for both diseases and insects. We've partnered with our friends in entomology to create this publication. So there are numerous ones of these up there. The ones for apple, peach, brambles, and strawberry and grapes, I think, are all listed in the resource page for this session. Another great resource is our Kentucky Pest newsletter. You can go onto the plant pathology website and register for that or subscribe to that. That includes articles that are written by specialists at UK and gives you great information in a timely fashion. It comes into your inbox every Wednesday. Gives you just kind of updated information about what's happening in diseases and insects, in weeds, all across the state, and gives you just some ideas of what might be coming down the pipeline or what you need to be looking for. Because there is so much misinformation out there about home gardening, understand that the temptation is there to Google search and just take some of that information. But there is a lot of misinformation out there, and we would hate for you to be headed down the wrong path. So rely on sites that end in .edu. Those are all connected to universities, and everything that the universities are putting out, including University of Kentucky, is based off of our research. So we've tried this. This is what we know. This is what we think works. So trying to get you the best recommendation that we can. So again, those sites are based on research, and so they're great resources and can really provide you with a lot of information. If you're not sure if something's correct, check with someone, check with your county agent, reach out so that we can make sure that you're getting the right information and you're not headed down the wrong path, because there's nothing more frustrating than that. And with that, you can also connect with us on social media at KY Plant Disease. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we post pretty regularly on there some different information about what's going on in our research, as well as what is happening with different diseases or what we're seeing out in the environment. Hopefully this was really informative for you, and hopefully you can use sanitation this fall to be able to make sure that you have a really successful growing season with your fruit next spring.